When people imagine who a narcissistic woman ultimately ends up with, they often picture a dominant man, confident, unshakable, and emotionally strong. But that image is largely a fantasy. What she truly gravitates toward over time is not strength in its mature, grounded form, but adaptability without resistance. This is a crucial distinction. True strength has boundaries. Adaptability, when unanchored by a solid sense of self, becomes malleability. And malleability is far easier to control. In the early stages, she may be drawn to confidence, charisma, even emotional depth. These qualities provide stimulation and validation. But as the relationship progresses, those same traits begin to feel threatening. A person who knows who they are does not disappear when pressure is applied. They question. They notice shifts in behavior. They recognize contradictions. For a narcissistic personality, this creates internal tension. Control begins to matter more than connection. So the man she stays with is often someone who learns, slowly and unconsciously, to adjust himself. He softens his opinions, edits his emotions, and anticipates her reactions before expressing his own needs. He calls this keeping the peace, but psychologically it is self-erasure. He is not weak in the conventional sense. In fact, he may be responsible, patient, and deeply loyal. But his defining trait becomes his willingness to bend rather than confront. Carl Jung spoke of the danger of losing oneself in adaptation to the external world. When adaptation replaces individuation, the personality becomes hollow. This is the tragedy here. The narcissistic woman does not choose the man who stands firmly in his own center. She chooses the one who can orbit around hers. And the final irony is this. The more a person abandons themselves to maintain the relationship, the more compatible they appear. But compatibility built on self-loss is not love. It is quiet surrender. The moment you stop adapting at the cost of your identity is the moment you stop being chosen. And that alone tells you everything you need to know. Another illusion many people carry is that intense chemistry guarantees lasting connection. In relationships with a narcissistic woman, chemistry is often very real, but it is also temporary and ultimately expendable. At first, emotional charge, passion, and excitement serve a purpose. They stimulate her sense of being desired, admired, and central. But chemistry is unpredictable. It awakens feelings that cannot be fully managed, and for someone driven by control, unpredictability becomes a threat. Over time, passion begins to feel destabilizing. Deep attraction invites vulnerability, and vulnerability risks exposure. A partner who desires her intensely may also see her clearly, and being seen, truly seen, is something the narcissistic psyche avoids. So gradually, the relationship shifts. What once felt electric is slowly replaced by something quieter, flatter, and more controllable. This is where the true selection takes place. She does not choose the person with whom she feels the strongest emotional pull. She chooses the one whose reactions she can anticipate, whose moods she can influence, and whose sense of reality subtly bends around her own. Control offers safety where chemistry offers chaos. Power feels more reliable than passion. Carl Jung often emphasized that what we repress does not disappear, it returns in distorted forms. When genuine desire is pushed aside, it often reemerges as domination. Instead of mutual attraction, the bond becomes hierarchical. One person leads, defines, and decides, the other adapts and follows. The relationship survives not because it is alive, but because it is stable in its imbalance. To the outside world, this pairing may appear calm, even mature. There are fewer conflicts, fewer dramatic highs and lows, but internally something essential has been sacrificed. The absence of chemistry is reframed as peace. Emotional distance is mistaken for harmony. What is really happening is emotional anesthesia. The deeper lesson here is unsettling, but liberating. If someone consistently chooses control over connection, it is not because you lacked value or depth. It is because real intimacy cannot exist where power must always win. When you stop mistaking intensity for destiny and control for commitment, you reclaim the ability to choose differently. And that is where real freedom begins. As the relationship reaches its later stages, something subtle but decisive occurs. The narcissistic woman is no longer searching for a partner in the true sense of the word. What she seeks is reflection, not companionship, not mutual growth, but confirmation. The person she ultimately stays with is someone who mirrors her beliefs, her emotional tone, and her version of reality. Difference, once tolerated or even admired, slowly becomes unacceptable. In the beginning, individuality can be enticing. A distinct personality offers stimulation and novelty, but individuality also introduces friction. A partner with independent thoughts will disagree, interpret events differently, and hold perspectives that do not always align with hers. For a narcissistic psyche, this is deeply unsettling. It threatens the internal narrative that must remain intact at all costs. Over time, harmony becomes defined not by understanding, but by sameness. So the surviving partner learns to reflect rather than relate. He adopts her language, echoes her interpretations, and reinforces her emotional conclusions. When she feels wronged, he agrees. When she reframes events, he adjusts his memory. This is not necessarily conscious manipulation on his part. It is a slow psychological conditioning, driven by the desire to avoid conflict and preserve connection. Carl Jung warned that when a person is unable to confront their shadow, they attempt to eliminate it externally. In this dynamic, the shadow is difference itself. Any trait, thought, or emotion in the partner that challenges her self-image is gradually suppressed or projected outward. What remains is a polished surface that reflects her back to herself. But a mirror cannot offer intimacy. It can only confirm what already exists. And this is the quiet emptiness at the center of such relationships. Without genuine otherness, there is no dialogue, no growth, no transformation, only repetition. For the one doing the reflecting, the cost is profound. Over time, he may feel strangely invisible even while being constantly present. His role is to validate, not to exist. And the moment he begins to reclaim his own perspective, the reflection fractures. The insight to carry forward is this: love requires two selves, not one self and its echo. The moment you are valued only for how well you reflect someone else, you are no longer in a relationship. You are in a psychological role. Recognizing that is the first step toward choosing yourself again. There is another pattern that becomes clear when you look closely at who remains and who is pushed away. Depth is tolerated only briefly. A psychologically deep partner, someone reflective, self-aware, emotionally literate, inevitably becomes a problem. Not because they are flawed, but because depth sees. And being seen is profoundly uncomfortable for a narcissistic personality. At first, this depth can feel magnetic. Insightful conversations, emotional intelligence, the ability to articulate inner states, these qualities make her feel understood and even admired. But depth does not stop at admiration. Observes patterns. It notices inconsistencies between words and actions. It asks quiet questions that do not accuse but reveal. Over time, this creates pressure. The relationship is no longer operating purely on performance. It begins to touch truth. Carl Jung believed that what we refuse to make conscious controls us from the shadows. For someone deeply invested in maintaining a specific self-image, a partner capable of psychological insight threatens that fragile structure. Depth invites accountability, and accountability feels like exposure. So gradually, the emotionally perceptive partner is reframed as too sensitive, too analytical, or too intense. What is really being rejected is awareness itself. This is why the narcissistic woman ultimately distances herself from those who encourage growth. Growth requires confronting uncomfortable inner material, fear, insecurity, dependency, emptiness. Depth does not allow these things to remain hidden, and rather than face them, she withdraws from the person who brings them into focus. The replacement is someone simpler in emotional terms, not because they lack intelligence, but because they do not look beneath the surface. Someone who accepts explanations without probing, moods without interpretation, and distance without meaning. This creates relief. The relationship becomes easier to manage because nothing essential is being questioned. For the deeper partner, this rejection can be especially painful. They often believe their insight could have healed the connection. But depth cannot save a relationship where truth is unwelcome. It can only reveal its limits. The reflection here is both sobering and empowering. If your awareness makes someone uncomfortable, it is not a flaw, it is information. Never dim your depth to preserve a bond that survives only in the absence of truth. The right path forward is not to be less conscious, but to choose relationships where consciousness is not a threat, but the foundation. There is a particular type of person who often remains close to a narcissistic woman for a long time, yet almost never becomes her final choice, the empath. This is the emotionally intuitive individual, the one who senses shifts in mood, offers understanding without being asked, and instinctively tries to heal what feels broken. Empaths are deeply valuable in these dynamics, but not in the way they hope. To the narcissistic psyche, the empath serves a function. Their sensitivity provides emotional regulation. Their patience offers reassurance. Their presence soothes inner instability without demanding real change. In the early and middle stages, this feels like connection. The empath believes that care, consistency, and insight will eventually lead to mutual commitment. But what is being formed is not a partnership. It is a resource exchange. Carl Jung spoke of projection as a way the unconscious relocates inner material onto another person. The empath becomes the container for emotions the narcissistic woman. N does not wish to process herself. Anxiety, insecurity, self-doubt, all are absorbed, calmed, and held by the empath. This creates dependence, but not attachment in the mature sense. The empath is needed, but not chosen. The problem arises the moment the empath begins to awaken, when they start setting boundaries, asking for reciprocity, or expressing emotional fatigue. The dynamic shifts. What was once appreciated becomes inconvenient. Empathy is welcome only as long as it is freely given and endlessly available. The moment it asks for balance, it is seen as pressure. This is why empaths are often kept close yet never fully committed to. They are ideal for emotional supply, but dangerous as equals. Their insight threatens the illusion that everything is fine. Their boundaries challenge the unspoken agreement that they exist to give without receiving. For the empath, this realization can be devastating. They often feel overlooked, undervalued, or replaced by someone who appears less caring, but this outcome is not a reflection of their worth. It is evidence of their capacity. The closing truth to carry with you is this: if your empathy is used but not honored, you are not failing at love. You are outgrowing a role that was never meant to sustain you. The moment you stop offering yourself as a refuge to someone unwilling to face themselves is the moment your true strength begins. By the time all illusions fall away, the pattern becomes unmistakable. The person a narcissistic woman ultimately settles with is often someone who has learned to live with less, and to call that adjustment love. Less emotional presence, less mutual curiosity, less reciprocity. What would once have felt like absence is slowly rebranded as stability. What is actually resignation begins to look like commitment. This final partner is rarely dramatic or deeply confrontational. They have adapted not only to her moods, but to her emotional limits. Expectations are lowered quietly, without announcement. Needs are postponed, then forgotten. Over time, they stop asking for depth because they have learned it leads nowhere. This is not indifference, it is conditioning. They convince themselves that wanting more is immature, unrealistic, or selfish. Carl Jung warned that when people abandon their inner life to maintain outer harmony, the soul pays the price. In this relationship, peace is achieved through emotional contraction. The partner survives by becoming smaller. They tell themselves that love means endurance, that understanding means silence, that loyalty means self-denial. And because there is no open conflict, the relationship appears functional, even admirable, to the outside world. But something essential has been lost. Love, in its true psychological sense, expands the self. It invites growth, friction, and transformation. Opposite occurs. The bond remains intact only because one person has stopped evolving. This is why such relationships can last for years without vitality. They are sustained not by connection, but by tolerance. The tragedy is subtle. The partner is not overtly abused, so they struggle to justify their emptiness. They cannot point to a single betrayal, only a slow erosion. Day by day, they accept less emotional nourishment and call it maturity, less intimacy and call it peace, less self-expression and call it loyalty. The final insight is stark but freeing. Any relationship that requires you to abandon your inner life in order to survive is not a refuge. It is a retreat from yourself. The moment you recognize that love should deepen you, not diminish you, you reclaim the authority to choose differently. And that choice, to want more and to walk toward it, is where your real life begins.